cyber attacks have underscored the changing nature of conflict in the 21st century. Until recently, cybersecurity was part of the realm of science fiction novels. Today, it is one of the fastest changing fields in a complex strategic environment, with governments establishing cyber commands and cyber warfare units dedicated to protecting their national interests. At a time of heightened regional tensions, cyberspace is in danger of becoming a new and contested battlefield.
Good afternoon. So, as we all know, cybersecurity is a topic that hardly leaves anyone uninterested, and it's hard to find a country these days that shouldn't be interested or doesn't have any stakes in international cybersecurity discussions. And there is hardly any conflict in the world that doesn't have a cyber dimension. So it's my honor to run this session where we are going to discuss about a very burning issue, yet an issue where an international solution is not in the immediate reach. And this panel, I think, is very well equipped to discuss the issue, because we have here representatives of skills and experience that really comes together in this context of cybersecurity. So I mean really high-level policy, I mean the legal background, the legal expertise, of course technology and hands-on private sector view, and last but not least, the terrorist and national security, homeland security dimension of resolving this equation. I will give the word to the panelists first to address some of these issues. I would start with Dr. Richard Falkenrath, who is currently principal with the Chertoff Group, but has served as the Deputy Commissioner for Counterterrorism at the New York City Police Department for several years, and also as Deputy Assistant to the President and a Deputy Homeland Security Advisor at the White House. So, Richard, what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the Asan Forum. Last year, this topic was not on the agenda, and I think it's indicative that it's now been added because it is a very important issue, complicated one. Cybersecurity is a very broad-ranging subject, so I think it's important to bound it a little bit. I'm going to exclude, for the purposes of my remarks, cybercrime and also socially motivated hacking of the sort that we see a lot of. And instead focus on the strategic, the military, and the economic hacking of a systemic and persistent nature. From a U.S. perspective, this problem is predominantly about China, because in the view of the U.S. intelligence community, most experts in the United States, China carries out these activities on an industrial scale with the sanction, at least the acquiescence, but we think in many cases also the sanction of the government itself. Now, recently there was an interesting attack out of North Korea against South Korea, the cyber side. These things, I think, pale in significance to this just truly massive effort that we see coming out of China, and frankly have seen since the 2006, 2007, 2008 period. One of these interesting issues with cybersecurity is there's really no quantitative sense of how big a problem this is. There's no methodology for racking up the total cost of the U.S. economy, or the total strategic consequence of what we're seeing. We have lots of anecdotes of horrible hacks. We have some data on the gross exfiltration of data. Exfiltration is a term of art for stealing it. So we can talk about so many petabytes are stolen per year. But there's no way to really correlate this amount of data that's extracted from U.S. government agencies or private entities to any sort of larger strategic loss. And that makes this a challenging issue for analytically and for government, since it's difficult to rack and stack it with lots and lots of other issues which are on the multilateral agenda and on the bilateral agenda. Global warming, pandemic, the rocks, the latest missile test, whatever it may be. Hard to compare. So while I will tell you that it is a consensus in the U.S. national security community that this is a very big deal, nobody can tell you how big a deal it is exactly. Now, what is U.S. policy with respect to cybersecurity, particularly as it relates to China? I'm going to give you 6 pillars of U.S. policy. The first is more fundamental than cybersecurity. It's policy towards the internet, which is, in general, the United States takes a hands-off approach to the internet. The internet is, in fact, the creation of the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Project Agency of DoD, and it was managed in its early stages by the Department of Commerce, but now the management and running of the internet has really been privatized, and the government, the U.S. government, it doesn't really have an internet policy other than in general to preserve internet freedom. In fact, in the under U.S. telecommunications law, the producers of software and of hardware and the purveyors of content through the internet are all indemnified or held harmless from any harm that may come from their products. Stark contrast to physical goods like cars and bridges, where if you do something bad, you can be sued. In the information space, it's a free ride from a liability perspective. So pillar number 1, hands off the internet. Pillar number 2 is protect.gov and .mil. So we spend billions of dollars a year, and it's rising, protecting U.S. government systems only. One area of the president's latest budget that is actually increasing is the cybersecurity budget for U.S. IT systems. Pillar number 3 is cyber espionage and offensive information warfare. So the U.S. is one of the pioneers in these techniques and takes it very seriously. And not a lot to be said about that other than that is something the government does. There have been some really notable cases that have gone into the public domain against the wishes of the government, the Stuxnet virus being one of them. I will say this, though, about the use of cyber espionage techniques by the U.S. government. It is fairly rifle shot, and it is not connected to, it's not vacuum cleaner-like, it doesn't suck in everything, and it's not connected to an industrial policy where U.S. flag chartered companies are the beneficiaries of it. It's really done for strategic reasons. Fourth pillar is really not a pillar, which is there's no consensus in the U.S. government writ large, and here I'm including Congress, on what to do with the non.gov, .mil domains. So private industry, educational institutions, and the rest, they're basically on their own in terms of cybersecurity to figure out as best they can how to protect their systems. Their cybersecurity legislation failed in the last Congress and even in this Congress, although one bill just passed the House. The president has said he'll veto it for completely obscure privacy reasons, and the Senate says they won't act on it. So there's no consensus on what to do with the non-governmental networks from a defensive standpoint. Some talk about better information sharing, some voluntary standards, some inducements, but basically no real policy. Fifth, since January of this year, the Obama administration has done something which it had not done until then, which the Bush administration never did, which is name names and directly associate China with its activity. And that was sort of not done publicly. It had been done privately, and Jim may talk about that because he was involved in it. But now the National Security Advisor gave a high-profile speech. President Obama talked about it. It came up in his congratulatory calls to the new president. So they are at least naming names, and internally it's undoubtedly being talked about more. And the last area is probably not known to many, but this is beginning to have an impact on the ability of Chinese exporters to get into the U.S. market. The case in point for this is Huawei, major Chinese telecommunications firm, which is basically last week or 2 weeks ago announced it's giving up on the U.S. market because of persistent problems with lack of trust and confidence in the goods it would sell. But also little known, in the continuing resolution that was passed by Congress in March, at the end of March, a provision was stuck in there applying only to 3 agencies, NASA, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Justice, requiring those agencies to do an assessment of the origin of any technology that they procure, and for the head of the agency to accept the risk associated with that technology if it comes from an agency subsidized, controlled, or connected to the Chinese government. This is quite a big deal. Now, it's just 3 agencies, but it's sort of a harbinger, I think, of what you're going to see in future, in part because of this issue. 2 last points, and I'll turn it over so we can have a discussion. Policy making with respect to cybersecurity is immensely fragmented, lots of different agencies doing different things, and not easily synthesized into a coherent strategy for the government as a whole, in particular because the agencies with the greatest amount of expertise carry out their activities in a highly compartmented way under immense degrees of secrecy, and are interested in exploiting in other countries exactly the sorts of problems which we, from a defensive standpoint, would like to not have. So case in point, the Stuxnet virus. Stuxnet virus, if you want to believe David Sanger in the New York Times, was a creation of the U.S. government, and it was used to target the Iranian centrifuge program. It did so by developing 4 what we call zero-day exploits on Windows operating systems, Windows and Siemens operating systems. Windows, a Microsoft product, Siemens, a German multinational. These 4 zero-day exploits were identified. Zero-day means no one's seen them before. They're brand new, so they haven't been patched. These 4 exploits were presumably identified by someone in the offensive end of the U.S. information warfare community and exploited in order to attack the Iranian centrifuge program. On the defensive end of what the government presumably does defensively, our job is to reduce the number of zero-day exploits and to help companies like Microsoft and Siemens who sell, frankly, to everyone, every single company, everyone in the United States, and then every industrial or utility in the country. And so what you see is the tension between a country that carries out offensive attacks by exploiting vulnerabilities in systems sold by Western enterprises to one that wants to be helpful defensively. It makes for complicated policy making, I think. Perhaps Jim can give us some insight on that. The last point I'll make is something that's on the horizon, and it's an interesting problem, which is a handful of very high-risk, well-funded private enterprises, mostly in the financial services community, are getting sick and tired of being attacked constantly, being essentially collateral damage in larger strategic competitions that the U.S. government is engaged in, when the U.S. government does essentially nothing to help them. And so they are experimenting with techniques that are inelegantly called hackback, which is essentially privatized counteroffensive action against the source of where they're being attacked. This is anathema to U.S. policymakers because it's going to create all sorts of problems. But their argument on the private sector side is, look, you're not doing anything to help us. We can't just play defense constantly. The best defense is good offense. And so let us, if you're not going to do it, go after the persistent threats that we see that are attacking us. This is a problematic concept. It's being argued in a number of corporations right now. The argument usually pits the general counsel, who's conservative and doesn't want to have legal problems, with some aggressive CIA chief information security officer. And there have already been a few of these incidents, and my prediction is in future you'll see more sort of privatized, business-originated counteroffensive action against international hacking syndicates.
Well, thank you very much. And while you're listening to the panel, you think of questions, because I hope we will return to remarks like, why is China advocating for a peaceful cyberspace in international discussions, and what is behind the U.S. government approach recently calling the current stage of cyber conflict the new normal. We go to a slightly different angle for now. Neil Robinson, currently a research leader at RAND Europe, and RAND is one of the organizations that has been involved in all of this from the very outset, in a way, has advised several governments, in the area of cybersecurity, worked with UK, France, Sweden, and has recently studied a few national cybersecurity strategies. And I understand he has today something for us on the European brand new discussion on cybersecurity strategy. Neil, please.
Thank you very much. And I would like to begin my remarks by thanking the leadership of the Asan Institute for inviting me to come over here and present. I'm, I guess, as the previous panelist said, one of the token Europeans here. So thank you for that. My remarks indeed will cover the recently released European cybersecurity strategy, which was published by the European Commission in February of this year, which might well be termed as another case of Europeans muddling through, this time not in the area of economic policy, but rather cybersecurity. The strategy itself takes the form of a communication, which is a non-binding legal instrument, non-binding European instrument, which aims to set out the stall of policy in three main areas relating to cybersecurity as viewed in Europe. The first of these is with regards to law enforcement cooperation. The second covers the improvement of network and information security measures, both in the public and the private sector. And finally, the third covers military and defence cybersecurity capabilities. I guess it's also important to note that the strategy for the first time includes within its ambit the area of foreign policy. So the EU essentially has articulated in the strategy what it regards to be a communication or an approach for its own position on the international stage with regards to some important international topics such as internet freedom, cooperation, and enhanced activities to tackle cybercrime, for example, through the promotion of the Council of Europe Cybercrime Convention. So the main message from my remarks is that this document is quite ambitious in pulling together 3 or 4 disparate policy domains, which, for those of you who are not familiar with European policy making, have traditionally been treated quite separately. So the important thing to recall is that the strategy aims to present these as a consistent, harmonised approach, perhaps aimed at tackling one of the risks that we see in this new world disorder that has been the theme of the conference today. So I'll tackle each of these areas in a bit more detail and offer some critique. Starting with law enforcement cooperation, the strategy talks about the establishment of the European Cybercrime Centre, which was established and set up at Europol, the EU's coordinative body to tackle organised crime in The Hague. And this was established, the Cybercrime Centre was established in January of this year. So the European Cybercrime Centre is seen as the main vehicle to pull together capability across law enforcement personnel, public prosecutors, training, and also the private sector to tackle cybercrime in a consistent and coordinated manner across the member states. We've seen fruits of that, for example, in the recent arrest of the Dutchman in Barcelona very recently, which came about as a result of a cross-border operation and the use of the European arrest warrant to find and arrest the individual concerned. However, there's significant issues with regards to cooperation in the area of law enforcement in Europe. The EU is a group of 27 countries. Each law enforcement unit has their own definitions of cybercrime, their own ways of approaching it, and there are marked capability differences with regards to intelligence collection, with regards to the focus on prosecution, which presents challenges with regard to setting up a coordinated approach. So that's one of the key challenges in the area of law enforcement cooperation that is set out in the strategy from February. The second area concerns network and information security, so what is known in European Union jargon as NIS, or really the basics of information security, both in the public and the private sectors. And here the strategy sets out a number of important initiatives, specifically relating to a requirement which will be set up through an additional legislative binding instrument, that each member state should have a competent authority, or a single designated point of contact at the national level to tackle cybersecurity, to be responsible for cybersecurity. And the idea is that these points of contact will evolve towards some kind of a European network of government authorities specifically charged and given the mandate to address cybersecurity and be responsible for these different aspects at the national level. However, one of the key challenges with this is that at present, in each country, the Computer Emergency Response Team of Last Resort, known as the National or Governmental CERT, is seen as the main vehicle through which these competent authorities will be set up, will be established. So this really highlights a possibility of, I think, some concern about how the CERT, which is traditionally operates on the basis of reaction, of fixing problems, of being a firefighter, will have the capabilities and the competence to look forward and to be more proactive in understanding how cybersecurity threats are changing at the national level. So there is a concern here about the way in which the strategy has identified the need for competent authorities and the way in which the operational practice is meeting that. And again, as you might imagine, with 27 countries, CERTs have different mandates, different legal basis, and there are particular problems with cooperation, the exchange of personal data, for example, being a big issue in Europe when emergency response teams are looking to share nominal data about cyber attacks across borders. So that's another set of challenges which revolve around the second part of the cybersecurity strategy. The final pillar of the strategy revolves around improving cyber defence. So as was mentioned with respect to the US efforts, a number of countries in Europe have also been bolstering their cyber defence capabilities, but really focused explicitly less so on the offensive side and more on the defensive capabilities. However, an example from the UK has been the expenditure of £650 million a couple of years ago to the cyber security programme. And that programme will be a four-year programme of investment alongside the UK's own cybersecurity strategy at the national level. So an example there of some quite significant investment. I think cybersecurity was one of the two areas that received additional funding in the last funding round in the UK in terms of defence. Other countries are also working on their national cybersecurity and cyber defence strategies in the military context. This includes Germany, Finland, Sweden and France. So there is some effort there and focus on training, capacity development and some of these more softer issues away from the sort of offensive capabilities that are often the focus in the international stage. But nonetheless, I think to summarise, we see an example of the European cybersecurity strategy as perhaps nothing new, essentially. These pieces were all there before. The strategy tries to put them together in some kind of harmonised, consistent framework. But as might be not surprising to many of you, there is the chance that institutional rivalries, each of these policy areas is owned by a different part of the EU policy machinery. So there's a great risk, I feel, that the strategy could become subject to some institutional rivalries in terms of how it's implemented and the future in terms of the effectiveness of the strategy going forward in tackling these types of cyber threats in the new world disorder. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And in fact, I remember from reading the strategy, mainly the last pages, one of the paragraphs there said that the implementation of the strategy will have to follow the European data protection regulation. And to me, as a former data protection lawyer, that tells me that we are basically back in ground zero, because essentially the pillars are not abolished. Yeah. But definitely a welcomed discussion in Europe, and turning back to the US, for a while. Mr. James Steinberg, currently the Dean of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University and a professor there of social science, international affairs and law, has worked with has worked on a very high level of policy making and policy approaches in the U.S. Served as a Deputy Secretary of State and served as Principal Deputy to Secretary Clinton. And earlier, 1996 to 2000, as the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Clinton. And that, if you remember, are those times where the U.S. Announced the global information infrastructure policy, and the world followed. So, and he also was a Vice President Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. So I very much look forward to your perspective on it.
Thanks. And at an earlier time, a colleague at RAND. So, well, it's great, as Rich said, that we've begun to incorporate this topic into Asan, because I think it is, as we think about what our earlier panel this morning talked about, the New World Disorder. I think this is actually an interesting dimension of that as well. And you know, I often say to people what my most important legacy was during my time as Deputy Secretary was, and I say it was creating the position of Cyber Coordinator in the State Department, which Chris Painter now holds. And I think it's important, and I say it only half in jest, because that bringing the State Department into the game in a comprehensive way reflects both how important this issue is, but also how multidimensional it is, and the fact that the State Department sees this through a lens not only of security, but also of economic opportunity, and of human rights and democracy and human expression, reflects the fact that there are enormous tensions and multi-dimensions to the problem. So we're going to focus on security here, but I do think it's important, as you talked about the data privacy law and the like, is to recognize that all of this has to be mediated through the fact that there are many, if you look only at the problem through a cybersecurity lens, you can develop a set of solutions which may be optimized or semi-optimized around security, but then don't take into account what the effect would be on commerce, or the effect would be on human rights and freedom of expression, privacy, and the like. And I won't talk about that here, but I think it's important to keep it in mind, because these conversations do tend to get compartmentalized. You know, it's because this is such a flashy and exciting topic, it's very easy to focus on the novelty and how this is an unprecedented, new, different, et cetera, phenomenon. And in many respects, that's true. But because the human mind is rather frail and limited its capacity, I always like to try to begin to think about problems like this through analogy, and to try to understand how much this is a version of problems that we've had to deal with before, and then understand in what respects it's different, so we can see how much and how effective the tools and strategies we've used in the past might be to be kind of translated to deal with the challenges here, and what the limitations of those would be. And you know, put simply, we often kind of tiptoe around this, but we're basically dealing with two phenomena, which are old phenomena. One is espionage/theft, and the other is sabotage, right? I mean, these are kinds of old words that have been used in old contexts before there were technologies and internets and computers and the like. And these were dangerous phenomena, and they were consequential, and people had policy, rules, strategies to deal with each of them. And I think it is important to think about, you know, those phenomena in the non-cyber, non-data world, and what we thought were the kind of the challenges that we had to face and how we approach them, and then to think about whether there are any lessons that can be learned to apply to them. And I think that what you discover is that there are some differences that would lead you to think about the need to adapt, particularly issues around attribution, issues about the possibility of the scale of the operations, you know, comparing what an individual spy or saboteur could do with what a sophisticated, persistent threat penetrator could do. The scale can translate from differences of quantity to differences of kind. Cost, another thing, the ability to do low-cost operations that have high impact. All are reasons to think that there are certain characteristics of these problems which are different. But nonetheless, I mean, we have learned how to deal with them. And I think that the first thing that we've learned, and I think is important, in trying to analyze the problems we have here is to try to understand the difference between the very damaging and disturbing elements of what's going on, whether state-sponsored or not, which largely fall in the category of theft or crime, as opposed to acts of state that are in furtherance of acts of state. Now, the line is somewhat blurry because the acquisition of technology through theft can be used by a state to achieve state-related objectives. But I think many of the strategies that a lot of us have talked about is at least to try to deal with the crime element of this, even when associated with state actors, and to try to look at how we've dealt with crime in the past. And we've learned a lot, and we have a lot of leadership in Europe, for example, through the Cybercrime Convention and elsewise, that lead us to think about how you develop international cooperation. And however effective the EU cybercrime strategy is, or the cybersecurity strategy is, we actually have a set of tools that begin to think about how states can interact with each other to deal with the perpetrators of cybercrime. Similarly, with respect to espionage, we understand that it is a phenomenon. You talk about the new normal, it's the old normal, right? This is something that goes on, and states have developed a set of tools as to how they deal with it, both defensive and retaliatory, that allow us to develop at least what some of the kind of guiding principles might be to deal with these problems. And similarly with what we now call offensive cyber operations, which in my judgment are either acts of war or sabotage, we have both rules, we have understandings about what states do and don't do here, and also practice about how we respond to them. So I think that as we think about a strategy going forward, it's important to try as much as we can to develop a set of tools around what has worked and we think has worked in the past, and then see where they need adaptation. As I said, with respect to the differences, one of the big challenges has been attribution. That it is obviously possible in the case of either espionage or sabotage that the perpetrator, if apprehended, it wouldn't be self-evident who was behind it, but there are usually ways of attribution. And I think one of the important focuses of efforts in the United States and elsewhere is to try to dramatically strengthen our capacities in attribution, because to the extent that we do and can do a better job in attribution, one of the important technical differences between this phenomenon and the past begins to be less of a problem. And it opens up to us a set of tools, because the more you can do attribution, the more you can begin to think about a set of both deterrents and punishments that can go along with that. And again, without getting into technical or classified stuff, I think it is true, and Rich may want to comment as well, is that we actually have made a lot of progress. And again, without talking about anything from my government experience, I think if you look at the Mandiant report, it really gives you some reason to think that this has been, we're making, now it's obviously an iterative game. The other side then begins to figure out how you begin to mask and spoof and the like. But it's not a hopeless game. And a lot of the kind of the popular literature about this, I think, perhaps overstates this and therefore makes this into more of a different kind of a problem than it was. The second sort of analogy, I think, on the offensive side is when we think about this in connection with state-to-state acts of imposing harm on others, either through in a war context or a non-war context, which is what sabotage is. And there, I think the two issues that we have to focus on are, one, is it possible to develop a set of rules that we can agree on in principle about the use of force or force-like activities in this space? And then, if we do, are there consequences? What are the opportunities for either enforcement or the application of principles of deterrence around the implementation and enforcement of the norms? And there again, I think the analogies are pretty powerful. In most of the discussions that have taken place, certainly within the US government and increasingly on the international level, there's a broad acceptance of the fact that the basic laws of war, both jus ad bellum and jus in bello, actually should apply in this context, that there are some technical questions about how you adapt it, but there's no reason for kind of a different legal framework for dealing with how these kinds of acts of aggression or use of force should be used. And that it is plausible to think about developing a set of principles that could be broadly accepted. As I say, I mean, it's I think, in growing sense within the U.S., across the range of actors, that is the right approach to the problem. It's been interesting in our conversations with China and others. China has been reluctant to move in that direction, but I think over time I actually am optimistic that will be accepted. So we have a chance to sort of begin to identify and adumbrate a set of norms around this. Then perhaps the more challenging question is, how do you enforce them? And again, although there are differences, it's not as if there aren't challenges to enforce the laws of war in the non-cyber world as well, including the problems of international enforcement of the laws of war. We have international tools, including the International Criminal Court and the like, that have begun to try to think about international measures. But there are also measures that are available to states to act in response to that. And this is something that Rich has talked very eloquently about, and which the U.S. government is just beginning to talk about, which is, if there are going to be norms, there have to be mechanisms for imposing costs for the violation of the norms. And I think this is one of the most challenging areas that needs further thought and work. But it will be important not only to give states tools to respond to violations of the norms, but also to have norms about what the appropriate, not only what violates international law, but what are the appropriate responses. Just as in the international context, we have Article 51 of the Charter, but what does that mean in the context of this? And while I agree with Rich, I hope this doesn't become vigilante justice by individuals taking this in their own hands. It becomes all the more important to think about what the responsibilities are for states there. I don't want to talk too much, though we'll have an opportunity, I'm sure, to talk about the U.S.-China dimension, except to say that I do think that one should not underestimate, and I'm beginning to believe that our friends in China are beginning to stop underestimating the pernicious effect of this activity on the broader set of relationships, not just between China and the United States, but more broadly. That there are only two possibilities, which is either China is correct that it's not behind this, and therefore is seriously derelict in not trying to do something about it, or that it's not telling the truth. And both of those are not very satisfactory, either from the perspective of China's partners or from China itself. And I was encouraged in the earlier discussion when Jia Guo indicated that his judgment was that the Chinese side was prepared to take this on, because I do think that there is an opportunity to do more here. And Rich has heard me make this analogy before too, but one of the relative important successes in U.S.-China cooperation over the last 2 decades has been the improvement in our cooperation in dealing with the challenges of enforcing non-proliferation norms about exporting proliferant technology to bad actors. 20 years ago, China had just, for the first time, entered the NPT. And in the first decade, the Chinese government essentially took little responsibility for either establishing export control laws or export control enforcement mechanisms to make sure that it was meeting its obligations under the NPT. Over the last decade, we've seen a sea change in that attitude. And it's come about in part because I think China has begun to understand that enforcing the NPT and the related export control measures is in China's interest, but also that in cooperating with the United States and others to enforce those rules, it's a tremendous mechanism for building trust between the two countries. And I believe strongly that there's again an analogy here that's possible for the United States and China both to develop the equivalent sets of rules about what's allowed and not allowed in terms of cyber operations, and then to develop collaborative and cooperative strategies to go against violations, particularly if these violations are taking place by actors other than government actors, although from the territory of either of our states. And it's an opportunity to turn what is now a very damaging dimension of our bilateral relationship into an area of actually building trust and confidence.
Well, thank you. Sometimes I think it almost looks as if there were only 3 countries talking about cybersecurity on international level, such as US, China, and Russia. And then there are a number of countries who also talk about the issue, but somehow do it in a second tier or kind of in a follow-up manner. Now, along these lines, I'm not going to ask how far we are in working out a resolution. I would rather ask you what prospect of a resolution for the world in this burning issue do you see? And at the same time, is the issue so burning? Because I was last year attending the Russian yearly International Information Security Conference, and their lead diplomat very clearly said that in his opinion the world doesn't have too much time to figure it out, because there is going to be something that changes our understanding of cyber conflict. Would you say so, or what's your estimate? Does the world still have a lot of time to figure out a good solution? And at the same time, Richard, to you, what do you think would be the national part to be resolved in cybersecurity versus what needs to happen on international level? So what are the things that we should really pay attention to on national level to develop a strong and viable position for the international discussions? Because my understanding is that still not too many countries have a strong national position. So I would drop the ball back to you for a second on international discussions, and then to you.
Well, I mean, part of it is I think we have to unpack what we're worried about before we can then judge how far we are. I mean, I think there is a lot of hyperventilation around these issues, cyber Pearl Harbors and the like. And I think, on the state-to-state level, first, I think that the espionage theft problem is an extremely serious one. But there are actually some tools to at least make this less huge a problem. And then there are a lot of things that can be done on the defensive side and the resilience side that Rich talked about that can help. But that's going to be persistent, and that's not going to go away, just like we know what states do. But what worries people most is the cyber Pearl Harbor, the kind of the consequential kinetic equivalent acts. And there I think we have to look at, what are plausible scenarios that we would have to worry about? I mean, a lot of this is, if you think about it, whether it's Russia, China, or some of the other states which have capabilities, what are the plausible contexts in which they would do this? I mean, the notion that there's going to be a bolt out of the blue for no reason that one of us is going to do this to the other is so thoroughly implausible and counterproductive to anybody's interest that it's kind of a silly concern. The worry about offensive operations, at least among the advanced states, would be in connection with a conflict which was otherwise emerging. I mean, let's remember what Pearl Harbor was. Pearl Harbor was an anticipation by Japan that they were going to go to war with the United States anyway, and so this was just the first shot in a war that they thought was coming. And in that context, I mean, it is clearly, as a part of integrated wartime operations, something that would be a big problem. But the answer to that is not a cyber problem. The answer is to not go to war and not to get ourselves in the position where we would even get close to the prospect of having that kind of conflict with each other. So on the offensive operations between states, major powers, I think, it will be integrated as part of military strategy, but the strategy to deal with that is not largely a cyber problem. So what are the problems? So one of the problems is the non-state cyber kinetic threat, which I think is an extremely serious problem. And there, because the tools of enforcement and deterrence are limited, we really do have to think about resilience and defense. I mean, I do think that that's because norms aren't going to bother a normless group which doesn't really care about those things. And therefore, we do have to think about, trying to figure out how we can limit the possibilities. And where we can't, and again, Rich can talk to this better than I can, it's like a lot we've learned about counterterrorism is you can't focus on stopping a specific plot. You have to focus on identifying the bad actors, irrespective of what tool they're going to use against you, whether they're going to use a cyber attack or fly planes into buildings. You're far better off just figuring out who the bad guys are and who are trying to harm you, rather than trying to figure out how you interfere with that particular tool. So I think it's only by unpacking that can you decide, how close are we to the dangers. And again, I think that the greater concern ought to be on the kind of the cyber terrorism side, rather than on the state-to-state side, other than this, as I said, this deep erosion in confidence about the intentions and the motivations of actors on the theft espionage piece.
Right.
So many issues on the table, and I think Jim's right, you really do need to sort of unpack them. Two observations first on the global level. Something Jim said quickly was worth underscoring. On the state-to-state military competition, it's now accepted by, I think, virtually all strategists that information operations, they actually always have been a part of military conflict, will be a major part of all military conflicts between major powers forever from now on. And so there is an issue there that even if though it isn't being, it was not going to be a bolt from the blue, nothing provoked it sort of attack, the war has not disappeared, and the strategic consequence of this massive exfiltration of data from the U.S., now I'm talking purely nationalistically, will only be knowable in the event of a conflict when it's utilized against you. And there aren't too many cases so far where you've seen that. Both the two key ones are both dealing with Russia, and once in the Baltics, once in the Caucasus. But you sort of saw the consequences of a state which was prepared to use offensive information operations in conjunction with essentially traditional military aggression, to the great detriment of the one on the receiving end. The second point, this is about Chinese theft and exfiltration of data, is a bit of a puzzle, which is that the scale of the data theft is far in excess of any evidence of its utilization by anyone, and so it's sort of this, it looks like this vacuum cleaner-like approach of U.S. government data and of corporate data, and indeed increasingly nonprofit data that is being collected, but not clearly being used for anything at this time. And so that sort of says, well, why is that happening? I mean, what is going on here that the Chinese government is prepared to acquiesce or sanction or direct this sort of, and it's frankly a bit of a puzzle, I think. Jim's got far greater insight than I do into what drives this. I, though, tend to believe, I certainly hope he's right. He knows the Chinese government very, very well. To date, I think it's safe to say they've suffered no consequences as a result of this pervasive and persistent theft. They've gotten harangued in private from time to time and occasionally in public, and there are certain businesses that won't do certain kinds of investment in China, but that was true even before cybersecurity and cyber espionage was invented, just on old style. Old style IP theft. So it strikes me as at some point, if they are going to have a reversal of the sort they had with their proliferation behavior, and I think we could spend a lot of time debating the validity of that analogy, at some point they're actually going to have to pay a price. And maybe it's enough for the senior leadership just to get harangued that they get sick of it and they sort of say, but I think something else will have to come up. You asked about the national level. I mean, the U.S., the national level policy responses. The United States is remarkable just how totally, we do not have a telecommunications or internet policy per se. The operation of the internet in the United States is totally beyond government control. And almost by design. I mean, in certain countries like Egypt or Syria or even China, the government knows how many national gateways there are into the national telecommunications space, and in principle can filter them or control it or turn it off. It may have changed. The last I checked, we don't even know how many international gateways there are into the U.S. information space. It's like the internet economy and the information space is not entirely above the law. I mean, there's lots of areas where the law does apply and does affect it, but there's no coherent U.S. policy on how to deal with that in its entirety. And indeed, the economic interests, there's a values interest, which is free speech, is a constitutional right, is immensely powerful. And the economic interests are immense. I mean, this is among the most dynamic, innovative, competitive parts of the U.S. economy. And, no one in their right mind on the national security side would try to muck with that. So I would say at the national level, there's very few clear, settled aspects of U.S. policy nationally. And then when you start looking at our domestic space, I mean, the special interests aren't even that small. They're huge special interests that I think, by and large, on almost every matter, swamp the ability of the executive branch to exercise discretionary policy.
Right. The reason I asked this question and to get to my next question to Neil is that I believe there are countries, when it comes to cybersecurity and then being able to formulate a national position to defend in an international level, then most countries in the world are very different from the United States. And so my question to Neil now, coming back to the European Union strategy, is, Neil, what do you think the strategy, when implemented, and as far as implemented, will really change for Europe? And for which countries will benefit mostly from the strategy, in your opinion?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, and also relates to your previous remark on whether the issue is so burning. There is a surprising degree of divergence, I would say, in, for example, some basic activities around understanding the threat models. So we conducted some research late last year looking into, at the national level, within senior strategic decision makers in a range of countries, how did they define, understand the cybersecurity threat? And it's actually quite surprising that only a couple of the big players in Europe, so it's the UK and the Netherlands, have actually got a formalised, what I would say is elaborate model in terms of saying, well, it's either nation state, intelligence agencies, cyber criminality, ideologically motivated groups, and so on. So that's one area where there is still a lot of progress to be made. Regrettably, the cybersecurity strategy doesn't talk about anything to do with threat assessment in that level. In terms of other aspects, so as I mentioned, the strategy indicates priorities for improving network and information security, both in the public and the private sector. There still remains quite some considerable scope for improving one of what I would call the basic things that would get us to an 80% of the way towards a solution, which is the quality of software code. So if the private sector was incentivized or perhaps policy intervention to encourage them to develop more secure software, that would, in my view, tackle a lot of the basic problems around vulnerabilities, zero-day exploits that were noted, for example. So there is a number of initiatives on that. Insurance is often talked about actually as a possible route to improving the state of affairs there. But I think there are some important differences between the US and Europe with regards to insurance about the possibilities for class action lawsuits, which means that the insurance model doesn't work quite so well in Europe, although part of the strategy does indeed include a breach notification regime for companies operating in the information society sector, so the likes of big social network service providers, search engines and so on. They'll be covered by a requirement to notify these competent authorities of major information security breaches. So that's another area where there could well be some progress. And finally, coming back to the defence and security area, I think it's a really important point that the co-panellists have mentioned about the fact that it's not new. There's a lot of concern that attribution is so difficult in cyberspace. Things can happen so quickly. Well, in actual fact, that I think it's more about tying together the traditional intelligence apparatus in a country at a national level to understand how to place more obvious indicators and warnings alongside the technical sorts of data that CERTs, information security response teams can exchange to help place those trends in a bigger picture. I think that's what's missing, and that is behind my concern about the focus on the computer emergency response team as the sort of main instrument of operationalizing the strategy at the national level. So those are just some of my sort of more practical thoughts on the strategy in response to your comment.
Thank you very much. I know you heard many keywords in this session, and this is how the cybersecurity discussions tend to go, because we are talking about enormously complex issue. And as you see from the panel discussions, although we haven't too much talked about privacy and then cybercrime, those are part of the equation. Maybe even a big part of the cyber hygiene equation that we need to definitely attend to before we hope to even get to hard security issues without having a real hard conflict in this domain. And coming from a legal perspective, and just to justify my presence in this panel, I must tell you that for any lawyer in the world, it will be really difficult to think in parallel, or yes, in parallel dimensions of privacy law, telecommunications, e-commerce, cybercrime, national security, international peace and security, and terrorism. And it's because it is not what we are really trained to do. We do real estate, or we do family matters. And that means that one of the biggest challenges that the internet or internet governance really poses to the world is this realistic implementation of the multi-stakeholder model, which tends to ignore part of how we are equipped to address the issue. But it's not about me, and it is about our panelists. So I really invite now you to ask the questions that you had coming to the sessions, and I hope that not all of them have been answered yet. Yes. Just a second, get a new one.
Hello? You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I should, yeah.
Wow.
Well, Kunimiyaki from Tokyo. I like to focus on the national security implication of the cyber attack. And please enlighten us, anybody from the United States or Europe, all of them are, on the study, ongoing study, legal study of how to describe the cyber attack as a trigger to justify the response, military response, to trigger the right to self-defense by cyber means or conventional means. I read the article some time ago about the study in the US government. Is this still going on, or what about in Europe? And what does it mean to the conventional international law, especially with respect to the right to self-defense? Thank you.
I just try to specify your question. Do you refer to a U.S. government study? Is it possible that you mean the Tallinn manual?
Somebody made a cyber attack against the United States.
I see.
When will it justify the U.S. government military response to the perpetrator or the original place?
That may go towards the U.S. strategy.
Well, so. I mean, I think Jim there's lots of papers and studies being written on these things. In general, the defense of the country is a presidential prerogative under the Constitution, the commander-in-chief, and he or she has immense discretion over deciding when and how to use defensive action to protect the interest. There was a statement by the Defense Department at some point that said, it didn't promise any sort of physical reaction and retaliation for a cyber attack, but said it was within the bounds of what the president. But it was really unnecessary from a legal standpoint. Jim actually is a lawyer. I play one on TV. From a legal standpoint, it's unnecessary because the fact is the commander-in-chief gets to decide these matters when confronted with a particular situation. And that's when they make the call. I will make the point, though, that says these operations in the United States, at least, have grown up from I think probably late 80s, certainly the 90s, have grown up not under the doctrine of the laws of war, but under the laws of espionage and covert action. And so you had, I think your point is exactly right about the different legal disciplines. The internet being created by the Commerce Department essentially and launched and turned into this incredible engine for freedom of expression and economic dynamism going on one hand. And on the other hand, people who operated under the cover of immense secrecy and compartmentalization, not carrying out the actions of war, but instead carrying out the actions of espionage, which occasionally would include covert action and sabotage done by covertly. That was the legal sphere in which these capabilities began to flourish. And I think it was in the Obama administration that suddenly realized, boy, this has gotten pretty big, maybe too big for the legal doctrine of espionage and covert action to handle. I don't know, but Jim lived this stuff.
Well, I think that, conceptually it's not all that challenging. I mean, in the sense that, there's I think a broad acceptance among the lawyers and the policymakers in the U.S. government that the basic principles about the laws of war and self-defense apply in the cyber domain. And it's very easy at the kind of poles of the application to know what it's like. And so, if you were to use the internet to blow up a building by using a cyber trigger to blow something up, that would be an act of force, and conducted by a state would be an act of aggression and could be responded to. So if you get a kinetic response in a real world that's triggered through a cyber vehicle, that's no different than it being delivered by a missile. That's easy, and people accept it broadly. At the other extreme, if you have exfiltration of data that doesn't destroy the data, and just copies it and takes it out, that's not, right? And it may be another problem, but it's not, it is not the equivalent to an act of aggression. And again, it may violate other norms and rules, but the problem is, then you get messy things in the middle. So, people spend a lot of time trying to decide if distributed denial of service attacks might constitute that if they cause harm as a part of it. Like, so what happens if there's a distributed denial of service attack that interferes with a 911 mechanism, and so people, first responders and somebody dies? Can you attribute that to the DDoS and therefore say that was an act of aggression? And there will always be application issues. That's the first part. The second one, just to reinforce Rich's point, is that just because you can doesn't mean you have to, right? I mean, that is, whether it's Article 51 or the conventional laws of war, doesn't mean that every act which theoretically could justify a response, military or otherwise, has to. And that's where the discretion of the commander-in-chief comes. And in that sense, it really has to look at what the context is, both who you think the perpetrator is, what the motivation was, and what you think broadly is the nature of the threat.
I must say, sorry, this is such an engaging topic, though. For the rest of the world listening to this debate going on inside the U.S. government, I have a hunch they probably don't take that much comfort in the notion that the laws of war will apply to U.S. action here. Since if we've learned anything since the 9/11, since 9/11, it's a somewhat elastic concept as applied to what the U.S. does and does not do. And there's certainly the administration which I served did lots of things which are highly controversial, perhaps illegal under the laws of war. But even the Obama administration has done things which internally in the domestic debate are immensely controversial. I mean, putting an American citizen on a kill list and killing him in Yemen, and then using military force in Libya without a war powers authorization from the Congress. I happen to support both. I have no quarrel with it. My point is, the idea that the laws of war somehow are restraining on the U.S. government, I think the president maintains a lot of discretion here.
I know you want to move on, but I think there's one. I mean, I agree in many respects with Richard, but the one part that I think is important, and I think is beginning to dawn on people more perhaps than it had, is that it may not restrain, but it does establish precedents. And so, I mean, the biggest constraint, in my judgment, is in thinking about lawyering this problem, which is saying, is this justified under the law of war? Is that if you conclude that your action is justified under the law of war, you're concluding a parallel action by somebody else also will be. And again, it doesn't mean they will or won't do it, but you have to worry about that. And I think there is increasing recognition that precedents are being set, and therefore people should, even though they may be able to come up with a legal justification to do it, they may, live to regret.
And now I'd like to get a sense before we continue, how many of you have questions? I see one there. Are there any others? One here. So I would take 2 questions at this point and start with you.
My name is Khalid. I am from UAE. As UAE is becoming more dependent as an e-government, more sophisticated in the Gulf regions, my question is that there is an international effort to make the governance law related to these issues? Because normally a cyber attack, it's happened through across borders, it's cannot coming directly from single countries, because normally the people, they use different access to get hacking or something. In the meantime, is the law or the governance today, if you justify it, you don't have enough means as a forensic to do the right investigation, and if it is done, is maybe in different directions. And sometimes, there is nothing is prevent the emotional issues. Example, in the 2006, when the Israeli, Hezbollah happened, war, we have get a lot of attack. This is mainly by emotional issues. Same thing is today with there is an attack in the nuclear, Iranian nuclear facilities. Also, we get some attacks as emotional issues. My question is, there is any effort from international perspective as a United Nations resolution or rules to put a certain minimum rules that govern all this cyber crime across the different countries, and to become more international issues than it is really an individual country in the main times.
Thank you. And we take the other question too. So on the UN question, any volunteers?
I can take the first question. Yeah, so the Council of Europe...
Sorry, let's hear the second question, just sorry.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Yong Zhang, and I'm from Asan Academy. And my question is, through the North Korea's cyber attack to South Korea, I saw that it is just blocking the internet homepage like that. And I mean, the cyber attack does not lead to the attacking or the stopping the power plant or the missile, missile battle between the North and South Korea. I think, isn't the cyber attack is overemphasized? Or I really want to know that, does it really cyber attack leads to the nuclear weapons go over into the Seoul or something?
Right. Neil, sorry for this. Please go on.
So, no problem. So to answer your first question, I think I would refer you back to the Council of Europe Cybercrime Convention, which, although has the label Council of Europe, actually has a number of non-European countries as part of the process. I was at the 25th anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the convention a couple of years ago in France, and indeed there was state parties there from as far away as Trinidad and Tobago and the Pacific Islands. So I would think that would be the main sort of instrument that's being discussed in terms of a treaty. There's obviously also the UN group of government experts, and there's the internet governance debate, which I'm sure Eneken also is aware of, about this multi-stakeholder process of involving not only government, state parties, but also the private sector and indeed NGOs. I think it's reflective perhaps of a technical, of a somewhat interesting polarization between perhaps the international affairs community and the technical people who are responsible for the running of the infrastructure, and you often see that they don't sort of get together in the same room very often. So part of that process will be to try and bring together the techies, the guys who run the infrastructure, who know the code, and the kind of foreign affairs and international relations community. So that would be my response to your question. On the question of the defacements and whether the implications of a web defacement are The same as, for example, infrastructure attacks or attacks exploiting vulnerabilities in SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition software. I would agree with you that they're orders of magnitude different, and I think I would perhaps refer back to Richard's opening comment where we need to understand a bit about the definitions. Clearly, we can't all be technical experts, but I would say there is a big difference between what is essentially electronic graffiti, someone coming along and spraying something on the front door of your house or your government organisation or your business, with something a bit more substantial of an attack perhaps against a power infrastructure or so on. So there's orders of magnitude difference, which I think is important when we come to start to think about what kind of response is appropriate and proportionate in that respect. So.
But I think that last point is important, because one of the laws of war is proportionality, right? So, I mean, you do have to take that into account in terms of the response, and that there are responses other than law of war responses to things. You can expel diplomats, you can take economic measures. I mean, there are lots of things that you can do. So I think it is. I mean, some of it is definitional, but some of it is really just good state practice. I mean, I think the other thing just to say on the UN side is that, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that in the two principal documents that the U.S. government has issued, both the international cyber strategy and in the Pentagon cyber strategy, there is a broad acceptance of the need to try to develop international norms here. And I take it as a significant statement by our military in particular, that they recognize that this is actually in America's interest to try to define it. And again, not to say it's not a difficult challenge, but the fact that this is no longer sort of seen as somehow kind of a plot by the international community to hamstring the United States, but actually something that everybody would benefit from, I think is a good step forward.
Thank you. Well, there would be many other things to discuss, but we are running out of time. I thank you very much for joining the first cybersecurity session of the Asan Plenum. I hope that the one takeaway from the session is that there are many reasons to have many more sessions like this. And I hope to see you again here soon. Thank you very much to the panelists.